The summer I turned 19, I loaded 43 bushels of sour cherries onto the flatbed trailer behind Grandpa's 1987 Ford F250 and drove them 17 miles down Route 9 to the Kelso County Farmers Co-op. It was a Tuesday in late July, one of those mornings that already feels used up by 8 o'clock. The air thick and close, no wind off the ridge, the thermometer on the barn door reading 81 before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. The cherries were Montmorency, old variety, from the 4 trees along the east fence that hadn't been pruned properly in at least 6 years. Small fruit, almost viciously tart, the kind you can't eat off the branch without your jaw clenching shut. I had them packed in borrowed wooden flats, 43 bushels, and I'd been up since 4:30 picking and sorting. My hands were stained dark at the creases, the kind of stain that doesn't come out for days no matter how hard you scrub. The man at the co-op receiving dock was named Gerald. I didn't know him well. He'd worked there since before I took over the farm in March, but I knew his type. He had the particular look of a man who has decided something before he hears it. He came around the trailer, looked at the flats, pressed a thumb into one of the cherries without asking, and made a sound in his throat like he was disappointed on my behalf. He offered me $5 a bushel. I said I'd been reading the regional pricing sheets, and Montmorency cherries were moving at $14 to $17 a bushel wholesale that week in Harmon County. He said, "Harmon County isn't here, sweetheart." There were 2 other men near the loading door. They didn't say anything, but one of them shifted his weight and the other one looked away, which is a particular kind of agreement that men do with their feet. I stood there for a moment. The cherries were 43 bushels of hard work in early mornings and the specific ache that comes from picking at waist height for 4 hours straight. I could feel the heat coming up off the asphalt. I thought about the payment due to Heller Agricultural Supply on the 15th. $180 I didn't have a clean margin on yet. I thought about the way Gerald had said sweetheart like it was a punctuation mark, not a word. I said fine, $5. He wrote me the ticket, $215. I drove home with the empty trailer rattling behind me, and I went straight to the small room off the kitchen, the one my grandfather had used as a study, and I sat down at his desk. Not because I had a plan, because that room smelled like him, like cedar and old paper, and I needed a minute before I did something I couldn't take back. That was when I opened the drawer I'd never opened before. The drawer was the bottom left one, the deep kind that's meant for hanging files, but that my grandfather had never used for files. It stuck a little, wood swollen from years of humidity, and when it finally gave, it gave all at once, the whole drawer sliding out heavy and nearly dropping to the floor. I caught it with my knee. Inside there were 3 things: a mason jar sealed with red wax, the kind you'd put up preserves in, but filled with something dark and liquid. A composition notebook, black cover, the cardboard corners worn soft as cloth, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the property. Not the current survey, something older, penciled in a hand I recognized as my grandfather's, but younger, shakier in a way that meant he'd been younger when he drew it. There were measurements I didn't understand and a notation in the northeast corner of the orchard that just said WR with a circle around it. I set the jar on the desk first. The liquid inside was deep red-brown, almost the color of old mahogany in certain light. When I tilted it, it moved slow. Whatever it was, it had been in that drawer a long time. The wax seal was solid, no label. I opened the notebook. The handwriting on the first page was not my grandfather's. It was smaller, more deliberate, the letters pressed hard into the paper the way people wrote when they'd learned penmanship from a nun with a ruler. At the top of the first page, in ink that had gone from black to a deep olive brown with age, were the words Morello, Season Records, 1961. Below that, a name I'd heard exactly once, at my grandfather's funeral, spoken quickly by a great uncle who'd driven up from Evansville and left before the food was served. A woman's name, my grandfather's older sister, who had died before I was born, who nobody had ever told me much about, the way families don't tell you much about the ones who didn't fit the shape the family wanted to be. I turned to the first entry. April 14th, 1961. Check the north block. 31 trees holding blossom. If we don't get frost before the 20th, we'll have a full crop. Spoke to Hanauer at the co-op about whether they'd take the volume. He said probably not. Too bitter for fresh market. I told him I wasn't thinking fresh market. I sat very still. Outside, the trailer was still hitched to the truck. The cherries were gone. $215. Gerald's pen scratching across the ticket. But she, This woman whose name I barely knew, who had sat at this same desk 62 years before me. She had looked at the same fruit and thought something entirely different about what it was for. I turned to the next page. The next page was dated 3 days later, April 17th. The handwriting was smaller, more compressed, like she'd been trying to fit more thinking into the same space. Drove to Vanderburgh County Library, found 2 books on fruit fermentation, one French, one from a university extension in Michigan. The Michigan one is more practical. Morello cherries have high acid content and enough natural sugar to support fermentation without excessive added sugar. The bitterness is not a defect, it is the flavor. 62 years old, that sentence. Sitting in a farm desk that smelled like linseed oil and old rubber bands, and it landed like something said directly to me. I kept reading. April through June was dense. Notes on sugar ratios, on the difference between a brandy base and a grain-neutral spirit, on whether she could get a temporary permit from the state of Indiana, or whether she'd have to sell the finished product through someone else's license. She'd written the name of a lawyer in Evansville and circled it twice, then crossed it out and written "too expensive" beside it. She'd written the name of a second lawyer and put a question mark. Then, in the margin, in pencil rather than pen, almost too faint to read, "Ask R if her cousin still works for the ABC board." I didn't know who R was. I didn't know who the cousin was. But I understood the motion of it, the way she was moving through every door that was slightly open, looking for the one that would open all the way. The June entries got shorter. More numbers, fewer sentences, ratios, temperatures, a sketch of a glass bottle with a handwritten label. Just a sketch, just her imagining it. And underneath, in her careful printing, Hartwell Sour Cherry Liqueur. My last name, her last name, the same name on the mailbox at the end of the gravel drive, on the deed in the county records office, on my grandfather's funeral program that was still folded in the kitchen junk drawer. She had put our name on a bottle. I sat back in the chair and the old springs made their complaint. Through the window I could see the north block, or what was left of it. 40 trees instead of 31, the one she'd counted in 1961, plus 9 more that someone had planted in the row between. The fruit was gone now, all of it, $215 lighter than it had been this morning. Gerald Foss's handwriting on a scale ticket, but she had not sold hers by the pound. I looked at the stack of notebooks. There were 7 of them. The one in my hand was the first, and I was barely into June of 1961, and the farm had been in our family since 1923. I turned to the next page. The next page was a recipe. Not the finished thing, not the version she'd refined and tested and finally written clean. This was the first attempt, dated June 14th, 1961, with a column of crossed-out numbers down the right margin and a brown ring where she'd set her coffee cup directly on the page. The proportions were wrong, and she knew it even then, because she'd written "too sweet" in parentheses after the sugar measure and circled it twice. She had started with brandy. That surprised me. I had assumed grain alcohol, the kind my grandfather kept in a gallon jug under the workbench for cleaning carburetor parts. But she'd begun with a commercial brandy. She'd written the brand name and crossed it out so thoroughly I couldn't read it, though I could count 6 horizontal strokes. Whatever it was, she'd decided it wasn't right by July. I could feel her working through it, page by page, the way I'd watched her move through a problem once when I was very small, standing very still, looking at a thing from different angles, not speaking. The ratios changed across 11 entries. Sugar decreased, the maceration time stretched from 2 weeks to 6. In August, she noted, in handwriting smaller than the rest, that her neighbor 2 farms east had given her a quart of something he made himself, and that she'd used it to understand what she was trying to avoid. I didn't know who lived 2 farms east in 1961. The land there was a soybean operation now, had been for decades. By September, the recipe had stabilized. I could see the moment it happened. The entry on September 3rd was written differently, the letters more upright, without the tentative slope of the earlier ones. She had figured it out. She wrote, "This is it. This is the one." And then, below that, in what must have been a separate sitting because the ink was slightly different, made 4 bottles, gave one to Ruth, kept 3. Ruth. The name appeared once more 6 pages later in October. Ruth says it doesn't taste like anything you can buy, which is the whole point. And that was all. Ruth appeared no other time in the first notebook, and I filed the name away and kept reading. The winter entries were sparse. She had planted cover crops in the south field. A cow had gotten into the orchard in November, and she'd spent half a day repairing fence line in the cold. She'd made 2 more batches of the liqueur, 8 bottles total, and her notes on them were brief and evaluative. Better, the maceration ran longer. like a scientist logging results rather than a woman in her farmhouse kitchen. I was so absorbed I didn't notice the light changing until the kitchen went gray, and I had to tilt the notebook toward the window. It was past 4 o'clock. I had not eaten since the feed store at 7 that morning. I set the notebook down and ate standing at the counter. 2 pieces of bread with peanut butter, a glass of water from the tap, because sitting felt like a concession to tiredness I couldn't afford yet. There were 2 more notebooks on the table. I had not opened them. Outside, the last light was doing what October light does in Harlan County. It went gold and flat and horizontal all at once, so that the orchard threw shadows 3 times its own length across the grass. I could see the trees from the kitchen window. They looked different to me now, not like a problem, not like a liability, like something my grandmother had understood in a way I was only beginning to. I washed my hands, dried them on my jeans, and opened the second notebook. The date on the first entry was March, 11 years after the last entry in the first notebook. The handwriting was the same, but tighter, more deliberate, as if she had learned to be more careful with paper, or with words. Marion came by about the Southfield lease. I told her the same thing I told her last year and the year before. The orchard stays. Marion. I knew that name. Marion Kosh, who owned the 200 acres east of us and who had sent her son over twice in the past 3 weeks to ask whether I'd considered selling. I had not considered it, but I hadn't known, until that moment, standing in the kitchen with bread still on the counter, that she'd been asking my grandmother the same question for years, maybe decades. I turned the page. My grandmother did not write about Marion again. What she wrote about, in careful half-page entries spaced weeks apart, was the liqueur. She had refined the recipe. She noted the specific gravity of the fruit in a good year versus a dry one, how that changed the sugar ratio, how the maceration time had to adjust accordingly. She had started using a single half-gallon mason jar for each small test batch before committing to the full run. She had tried aging one bottle for 18 months against a fresh one and written, "The 18-month is not better, it is different. Both are right depending on who is drinking." There was a phone number on the inside back cover of that notebook, written in pencil, very faint, with 2 words above it in pen, "Ask Ruth." I stood there for a long time looking at it. Then I went to find a piece of paper and copied the number down before I lost it, because the pencil was the color of old newsprint and I was afraid it might not survive another winter in an unheated barn. I did not know yet if the number was still active. I did not know who Ruth was exactly, or what she had been to my grandmother. But the name had appeared 3 times now, and nothing else in either notebook had appeared 3 times. I waited until the next morning to call. I'm not sure why, partly because it was already past 7 when I found the number, and calling a stranger after 7 felt presumptuous in the way my grandmother had taught me presumptuous feels. Partly because I wanted to sit with the name a little longer before I put a voice to it. I made supper, fed the chickens, checked the water line at the east edge of the orchard where the fitting had been slow dripping for 2 weeks, and then I sat at the kitchen table with the copied number on a torn piece of brown paper bag and drank 1 glass of water and then another and went to bed. In the morning, the temperature had dropped to 31 degrees. October 14th, a Wednesday. The grass was stiff and pale when I walked to the barn at 6, and my breath came out in visible clouds, and I thought about the cherries still in the cold room in their jars and whether the temperature in there was regulated well enough. The cold room held at 52 degrees as long as the house stayed heated. It had always held, but I checked anyway because that is the kind of person I was becoming, the kind who checks even the things that have never failed. I called the number at 8:30 once the morning chores were finished. It rang 4 times. I had already started composing in my head what I would say to voicemail when someone answered. The voice was older, clear and unhurried, the way people speak when they have learned not to spend words carelessly. I explained who I was, my grandmother's name, the farm, Harlan County. I said I had found the number in a notebook, written in pencil, with her name above it. I said I wasn't sure if this was still the right number, and that I was sorry to bother her if it wasn't. There was a pause, not the pause of someone searching for who I was, the pause of someone who had been expecting this call for a long time and was deciding where to begin. She said she had known my grandmother for 31 years. She said she lived 40 minutes north, outside a town called Crestline, and that she had a small operation of her own. Not cherries, pears mostly, and some quince nobody wanted to buy anymore. She said my grandmother had been the one to teach her about cold maceration, specifically about not rushing the first month, and that she still used a notebook with the same exact section headings mine had. Then she said something I wrote down immediately because I didn't want to lose the phrasing. She said, "Your grandmother told me once that the liqueur wasn't really about the cherries. She said it was about what you were willing to wait for. I asked if she would be willing to meet. She said yes without hesitating. We agreed on a Saturday, the first one in October, the 3rd, which gave me 4 days to get the barn organized enough that I wouldn't be embarrassed if she asked to see the operation. I spent those 4 days doing things I should have done in August. I swept out the fermentation corner and stacked the empty carboys in a single row. I found a piece of pine board in the machine shed and cut it to fit as a shelf above the work table, so the notebooks and the pH strips and the thermometer had a place that wasn't the floor. I wrote the current sugar readings on a strip of masking tape stuck to the side of each jar, the way my grandmother had written them in her notebook. 1 column of numbers per week. I did not call her back to confirm. I did not know why, except that the call had felt complete in a way that made me afraid to touch it. She arrived at 9:14 in the morning, which I remember because I had been watching the driveway since 8:45, and the waiting had made the time specific. She drove a white Ranger, probably a 2001 or 2002, with a cracked windshield that had been repaired in one corner with clear tape. She was in her late 60s, I guessed, with short gray hair cut very practically, and the kind of hands that matched mine now, wide at the knuckle, stained faintly at the cuticles from something organic and permanent. She stood in the driveway and looked at the barn before she looked at me. Not in an assessing way, in the way of someone looking at a place they have been described but never seen, checking the description against the real thing. Then she looked at me and said, "You have her posture." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just held the barn door open and let her walk in ahead of me. She went straight to the fermentation corner, which surprised me, and crouched in front of the largest jar without asking permission. She tilted it slightly in the light, not enough to disturb anything, just enough to read the color. She did not say anything for almost a minute. Then she stood up and asked how long it had been in this stage, and I told her 7 weeks. And she nodded once, the way someone nods when a number confirms something they already suspected. She asked to see my grandmother's notebook. I had carried it out from the house that morning and left it on the work table without being sure why. I handed it to her. She opened it to the middle section, the ratio tables, and ran one finger down the left column without reading aloud. Then she turned to the back pages, the ones I hadn't fully decoded yet, and her expression changed into something I couldn't name from where I was standing. She stood at the work table for a long time after that, her back to me, the notebook open in both hands. The light through the barn's side window was the low, sideways light of late afternoon, and it caught the dust above the fermentation jars in a way that made everything look very still and very old at once. I watched her turn one page, then stop, turn another, stop again. The pauses were not the pauses of someone struggling to read. They were the pauses of someone recognizing something. Finally, she set the notebook down on the table without closing it, and pointed to a line in the back section, the part I had been reading as a recipe variation, something about proportions and timing, written in my grandmother's compressed cursive that always slanted hard to the right when she was working quickly. She said, "This isn't a ratio, it's a rest period." I came around to her side of the table and looked where her finger was. The notation read, "Hold 9D, no agitation," which I had interpreted as an instruction to let a secondary fermentation settle before adjusting the sugar balance. She shook her head before I could say any of that aloud. 9 days of no contact at all, she said, after the 3rd rack. Your grandmother wasn't stopping the process. She was letting it develop memory. I asked her what that meant, and she smiled, not at me exactly, but at the page, and said that some older producers believed that repeated racking too early created a flat complexity, that the liquid needed one sustained period of complete stillness to resolve itself on its own terms. She said she hadn't seen it written down like this in a home recipe since her mother kept one in the 1970s, and that most people had stopped bothering with it because it felt like waiting for nothing. But you can taste the difference, she said. In the finish, there's a depth that doesn't come from adding anything. I looked at the jar in the corner, 7 weeks in, 2 weeks past my 3rd rack, and I had been about to move it again this coming Saturday because I thought the color meant it was ready for the next stage. I asked her if I had missed the window. She tilted her head and thought about it with what looked like genuine care and said she didn't think so. She said the notebook's timing was written around a cooler environment than most people kept, which meant in a space like this barn, in October in this part of the state, I might still have 4 or 5 days. She picked up the notebook again and looked at the back cover, turning it over in her hands, and I saw her notice the initials my grandmother had pressed into the bottom corner. Not carved, pressed, with something blunt, like the end of a pen. And her expression did that thing again that I still couldn't name. I asked her what she was looking at. She set the notebook down on the workbench with the kind of care you use for something you've decided not to hold anymore. She said she used to know someone who pressed their initials that way, that she had seen it before, on other things, a recipe card, she said, and then she stopped herself there, as if the list had become longer than she intended to share. I waited. She picked up her coffee and held it with both hands and looked at the jar in the corner rather than at me. She said that the woman she was thinking of had been particular about her process in a way that other people sometimes found difficult, that she kept to timelines that didn't always make sense until much later, when they did. I said I thought I knew who she meant. She looked at me then. She didn't ask how. I think she could see it in my face, the way you can tell when someone has been living inside a story long enough that it has become their own. She asked me which notebooks I had. I told her about the two, the one I'd been working from, which was the process notebook, and the smaller one I'd found first, which was more like a record of seasons, which years were dry, which years the fruit came early, which years she'd had to push the whole timeline back because something in the previous stage hadn't settled the way she'd wanted. The woman across from me went very still. She asked me if I had both of them here. I said one was in the house and one was in my hands, and I could go get the other if she wanted to see it. She said she would very much like that. I left her in the barn. It was cold enough now that my breath was showing when I walked across the yard. The ground hard under my boots, the bare oak at the corner of the house throwing a long shadow across the drive. I went upstairs and got the seasonal record from the drawer of the nightstand where I'd been keeping it close. And when I came back down the stairs, I noticed my hands were moving a little faster than usual. She was standing when I came back into the barn, not sitting. She had moved slightly closer to the shelf where the jar sat, not touching anything, just standing near it, and there was something in her posture, the way her shoulders were set, that told me she had been very still the entire time I was gone. I handed her the smaller notebook. She opened it to the first page, and then she turned to the second page. And I watched her face change in a way that took the whole room with it. She turned to the second page and went very quiet. Not the quiet of someone reading, the quiet of someone who has stopped breathing without noticing. The seasonal record was where my grandmother had written in her own system of documentation, not just temperatures and yield weights, but observations, the exact number of days between first blossom and peak bitterness, the correlation she had noticed between wet April weather and the intensity of the malic acid content that year. The way she had begun adjusting her harvest window not by the calendar, but by the color shift in the underside of the leaves. 2 weeks of data per page, written in pencil so soft it had almost faded to nothing on some lines. The woman from the distillery turned to the third page, then the fourth. She was reading the way people read when they are trying not to show that something matters to them. I watched her thumb slow to page near the middle of the notebook. I knew which one without looking. It was the entry from the third week of August, 1987. Where my grandmother had written a single underlined sentence below the usual columns. This is the year I finally understood what I was growing. She read it again. I could tell by the way her eyes moved across it. Then she closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment before she looked up at me. She said the flavor profile in the test batch was unlike anything they had been able to source from commercial orchards. She said their production coordinator had flagged it immediately. She said they had been trying for 3 years to replicate the bitterness to sugar ratio that made certain older European liqueurs distinct from anything currently produced domestically, and that what she had tasted from my jar was the closest anything had come. I said that the trees were about 60 years old. She nodded like she already knew that, or had guessed it. Then she asked if I had ever considered a supply contract. Not a one-season arrangement, a multi-year agreement with a fixed price per pound at harvest, adjusted annually by a modest index with an option clause for a second orchard block if I ever chose to expand. I asked her what fixed price she had in mind. She told me. I looked at the middle distance for a moment, not to perform composure, but because I actually needed a second to let the numbers settle into something real. It was more than 4 times what the co-op had offered me in September. It was enough, if the trees produced at the level they had this year, to retire what remained on the equipment loan by the end of next season. I looked back at her. She was watching me carefully, both hands still on the notebook, waiting to see what I would do next. I told her I needed to read anything before I signed it. She said that was exactly the right answer, and she slid a folder across the table. 12 pages, single-spaced, tabbed at the key clauses. I had not expected a draft to already exist. She read my expression and said she had done her due diligence before making the drive, that she didn't treat anyone's time carelessly, including her own. I took the folder home that evening and sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light until past 11. I had a legal dictionary my grandfather kept on the shelf above the radio, a 1974 edition, cloth bound, the spine repaired with electrical tape, and I used it more than I expected to. The contract was not complicated, but it was precise, and I wanted to understand every phrase before I formed an opinion about it. The price per pound clause was exactly what she had quoted. The index adjustment was tied to a USDA commodity baseline I recognized from the co-op newsletters. The option clause for a second block was written in my favor. I held the right to decline it with 30 days' notice, and there was no penalty structure attached to that refusal. The exclusivity language was narrow. It applied only to the specific variety from the specific trees on this property, not to any other fruit I might grow or any other buyer I might develop. I read the termination clause 4 times. It was mutual and symmetric. Either party could exit with 90 days' notice after the first full contract year, and neither party owed the other a financial penalty beyond the proration of any advance payments already made. She had not buried anything in it. I had expected something to be buried. I made a list of 3 questions on the inside cover of my own notebook. One was about the delivery logistics, whether transport costs were borne by me or by her company. One was about the grading standards, specifically who adjudicated a disputed grade at delivery. The third was about what happened if a late frost reduced the crop below a threshold I could not control. I called her the next morning. She answered on the second ring. I asked my 3 questions in order, and she answered each one without hesitation, which meant she had thought about them already or had been asked them before. Delivery costs were hers. Grade disputes went to an independent assessor from the State Agricultural Extension, jointly selected. Force majeure applied to weather events documented by the county, and the contract would simply pause without penalty until the following harvest year. I thanked her. I said I would give her an answer by the end of the week. She said there was no rush, and she meant it. Her voice had the steadiness of someone who was confident but not pressuring, which told me something useful about how she ran things. I called her back on Thursday, 2 days before the end of the week I had promised. I told her yes. She said she'd have the contract to me by Friday, and she did. 12 pages, clean and direct, with the 3 provisions I had asked about written in exactly the language we had discussed. I read it twice. I signed it and mailed it back the same afternoon. That was October. The following July, I delivered 430 pounds of sour cherries, graded superior, which I did not expect, to a refrigerated truck that pulled down my road at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. The driver had a clipboard with my name on it, spelled correctly. I watched the crates go in. I watched the doors close. I stood in the road until the truck was gone, and then I went back to the barn and started my day. The first payment cleared 11 days later. It was enough to replace the cooler in the cellar and still leave a margin against the following winter's heating costs. I keep my grandmother's notebook on the shelf above the kitchen table now, beside my own. Hers is the older one, the spine held with a strip of electrical tape she put there herself sometime in the 1970s. Mine is newer, a plain composition book I started the March I arrived, but it's filling up. The handwriting is different. Hers slanted left, mine goes straight. But when I hold both of them together, the weight is similar. There's a building on this property I have not yet opened, a stone ice house set into the hillside at the north edge of the orchard, maybe 60 yards from the oldest cherry trees. The door is iron, original hardware, and the hasp is closed with a padlock that I haven't found the key to. I asked an older neighbor about it last spring, and she thought for a moment and said my grandmother never spoke of it, which is a different thing from saying there is nothing in it. I'll get to it. Probably this winter, when the ground is frozen and there is time to be deliberate about it. That's the thing about these places, the old farmsteads, the ones that have been held by the same families through several generations of hard seasons. They don't give everything up at once. They give it up slowly, in proportion to how carefully you pay attention. The buildings that look empty are often the ones with the most left in them. The drawers nobody has opened in 40 years, those are the ones worth opening slowly, with good light, when you have time to read what you find. If your family left something behind in a place like this, I hope you go look for it. And if you found something already, leave it in the comments. I'd like to know what it was.